learning into action. So oftentimes we hear from students in our programs that, school today there's not enough of actually deepening their learning, making it matter. So how am I actually making an impact on my community? Not just learning about what's going on in the world, but how can I make change now? And with our friends at the Red Cross, the Canadian Red Cross, who have sponsored this event, we're able to have that progression. So not only are you having these amazing learning experiences with experts joining us live from around the world who are really doing this work in important contexts, but you can make that learning an action and make a difference in your community at the same time. So thank you to everyone who's joining us today, who've started to do that work, who are sharing their stories and their learning activities and their art with us so that we can share it with you. I want to quickly just highlight some of the classrooms that are here. Of course, our friends who just logged on, I see from Trinidad, are not included in this map because it is a Canada-specific map, but we wanted to say hello and welcome them to the meeting as well today too. But you can see that we have classrooms from all across Canada who have been engaging in this important learning activity over the last month. Now I'm going to stop sharing and pass over to my great colleague Yasmin, who's joined us, and she'll be giving another welcome, a land acknowledgement for the morning and starting us off in conversation. So Yasmin, welcome, over to you.
Perfect. Sorry, Sarah, if you actually just wanted to reshare the slides just for internet purposes. I believe there's a little bit of a lag on my end when I share the slides, but I'm more than happy to speak in terms of the rest of the slides. So thank you very
If you want to pull up the slides, Sarah, I'll speak to the land acknowledgement. It looks like we've just lost Yasmin again. So I'll keep us going. And I just, while you're getting that ready, I would like to just quickly address that much of the work of the Canadian Red Cross does take place in the Ottawa region. That is where I'm also joining all of you today. So we would like to recognize that our operations in the Ottawa area take place on unceded Algonquin territory. The Algonquin people have never relinquished, sold, traded, or transferred ownership of their land. The Canadian Red Cross recognizes and supports the health and wellness goals of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities across Canada, and we remain committed towards realizing community goals through the Canadian Red Cross's ongoing commitments to advancing reconciliation, cultural safety and integrity, community-led programming, and collaboration with Indigenous leadership. And if we can just have the next slide. So again, I see here we have an example of one of the photos that Angela Hill shared with us in our humanitarian exchange from deployment in Somaliland. And again, we would just like to share that we have a number of exciting speakers with us today, including Angela Hill, who we'll hear from later, and my colleague Fanny Desjardins-Dion, who we are about to hear from very shortly. On that note, I would like to welcome Fanny to the floor. I see we have Yasmin back, and I'm going to see if Yasmin, if you are able to share the Slido poll while we're welcoming Fanny to the floor. If you can pull that up for us, I will paste the link in the chat. And before we jump into the poll, I'm now going to hand it over to Fanny to share her introductions, and then she'll get us started with a very exciting interactive quiz on international humanitarian law to test our knowledge of what we may or may not recall from Sophie's talk last time, but also to test our knowledge of what we may have learned with the summit activities that some of your teachers walked you through. And if you see something in Fanny's questions that you've never seen before, take your best guess. You'll be quite surprised at how much intuitive knowledge informs your response to the questions. So I'll hand it over to you, Fanny.
Thanks, Andrea. Hi, everyone. So my name is Fanny Dajnedian. I work at the Canadian Red Cross as International Humanitarian Law Coordinator. I'm really happy to be with you today. I attended last event too, and I wasn't participating, but it was really great to see you all and to see your motivations and to hear all your questions. So I'm going to ask a few questions now. And what we'll do is we'll see what your answers are. If you have questions, we'll figure out a way for you to ask them maybe after each question or at the end, but we'll have time to briefly discuss if needed. So we can start right away with the first question. So true or false, the Geneva Conventions are the names of the conventions that protect civilians during times of war. So I can leave you a little moment to answer. If you are not live and watching that online, it would be the great moment to pause the video and to allow the class or people with you to answer too. So I will leave you some more time. I see that there are a few answers and it's beginning to look like it's unanimous. So it is indeed true. So the Geneva Conventions are the names of the conventions that protect civilians during times of war. There are additional instruments too, but the 4 Geneva Conventions are the main one. So just for a little information, the first Geneva Convention is to help out the wounded soldiers on the battlefield. The second one is wounded soldiers at sea. The third one is the prisoners of war. And the 4th Geneva Convention is mostly for civilian population and situations of occupation. So there are a lot of articles that protect different people, but the Geneva Conventions are some of them. So we can go to the second question. So another true or false. Armed groups can set fires to forests for surveillance purposes and can poison water systems to kill the enemy, according to IHL. So can the armed groups do that? And they set fire to forests and poison water systems? I see that there are 10 answers. So we will, 11, it's more false than true. So, and the answers. So it is indeed false. So in international humanitarian law, we recognize that war is happening and war will necessitate some attacks. So the military can launch some attacks, but there are some things that are limited. So setting fire to a forest or poisoning water, it would definitely have a non-proportional impact on the civilian population. So it is prohibited to do so. So if it affects the survival of the civilians, it is not fair part of armed conflict. So it is indeed false. So another question, true or false? IHL limits the damages that armed parties can cause to the environment. All right, we'll wait a little more. I've seen more answers earlier, so okay, so most of you answered that is true. So it is indeed true. So international humanitarian law limits the damages that armed parties can cause to the environment. During a war, during armed conflict, it is most likely that there will be impacts on the environment. That's part of it. When it's not intentional, a forest can be affected by an attack somehow. But IHL is there to make sure that the damages are as limited as possible. So that's what IHL is for, namely. So everyone, but mostly the civilian population, isn't too affected by the armed conflict. So there are limits that the damages that can be caused to the environment. So in general, long-lasting, and I don't remember the exact words, but long-lasting and critical and severe damage is prohibited to the environment. All right. So true or false, agricultural crops, farm animals, and other items indispensable to the survival of the civilian population are protected under IHL. You think it's true or false? So the majority is leaning towards true. Let's see. All right, so once again, it is true. So majority was right on this one. So all the items that are indispensable to the survival of the civilian population are protected under IHL. So it is prohibited to directly target that. So you cannot burn an agricultural crop, you cannot target farm animals because they exist, they are at the disposal of the civilian population. And if you attack that, the impact on the civilians would be disproportionate. And what we are doing with IHL is we want to make sure that if an armed conflict is happening, the population, the civilian population, is protected from its impact. So by attacking items indispensable to the survival, that would have an important impact. So it is prohibited to target that. All right, so another true or false. So now we're drifting apart from the environment and we're talking a little more about displacement of population. So true or false, similar to refugees, internally displaced people, so IDPs, are people who have fled into neighboring countries for protection. Ooh, 50-50. Okay, so as you see on the screen, the answers are quite, it's tight to know what is true or false. So the answer is, I can break down the sentence. So it is similar to refugees, internally displaced people, but the most important word in that sentence would be internally displaced people. So a refugee would have to flee his own country, while internally displaced people, you have to flee where you are, but internally, inside the country. So the situation is quite similar if you have to flee where you live to go somewhere else. But in cases of internally displaced people, you stay in your own country, which doesn't mean it affects less. So sometimes it can have the equal impact if you're in a big country and you have to change cities. But when we talk about internally displaced people, you have to switch cities inside one country. And refugees will mostly flee into neighboring countries. So that would be the main difference. Okay, so multiple choice. What are 3 environmental impacts of armed conflict? So you can select more than one answer here. So we have oil spills, deforestation and fire, fumigation. Oh, I read it in order, and chemical pollution, and explosion of mines and bombs. Right. So as you see, what we asked was 3 environmental impacts, but of course, armed conflict can have way more than 3 impacts. So all of these answers are realities that can happen. So war can be happening whether we are targeting the environment or not, and the environment can still be impacted by it. So all of the above were impacts of armed conflict, but I think you selected well. Deforestation and fires are events that are occurring a lot in armed conflict, and that's the answer most of you selected. But everything that is listed there and even more can have an impact on armed conflict, and that's why IHL wants to protect it, because we know that the population needs the environment and a healthy environment to actually survive and live. So that's why we protect it, and that's why we protect it from those impacts and many more. So we can go to the next one. I don't know if there are more questions. No. All right. So congratulations. Thank you all for answering. I think if there are questions or comments, maybe you can put them in the chat. If you want to talk about one of the questions, we could do that briefly, or later. I think there is a moment that is destined for conversations too.
Fantastic. Again, as Fanny had mentioned, if you do have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat as we go. You can also feel free to connect with us once this event is over. So you can send any questions that you have for Fanny or Angela once Angela presents as well to humanitarianeducation@redcross.ca as well. But we're going to go ahead and move forward just so that we keep on track with time as well. So again, a huge thank you to Fanny for the helpful refresher on international humanitarian law. Those were some very helpful bits of knowledge on IHL that students can borrow for their poster campaigns as well. Okay, so we now like to look a little bit more closely at ways that students can share their voice on these summit themes. And we're going to now look at the role of art and posters in social change. So I'd like to invite our partner, Sarah Flynn from the Center for Global Education, to share some examples of student art that was submitted for another campaign, Art for Climate. So we're going to look at some of the ways that students have highlighted climate concerns in their artwork and look at the links with armed conflict in some of the examples. We also do have some student posters that were sent in by students from Mr. Getty's class at York Mills Collegiate Institute and other classes as well that I will share afterwards. So the floor is yours, Sarah.
Wonderful. We had some great responses from our students who are a part of this learning group from Edmonton Catholic. And though they didn't produce posters, they did want to send us along some art that had been made in their school that they really felt resonated with what they were talking about in their classrooms. And so these are from their classmates in Edmonton Catholic schools. We have this lovely picture here, and then some pertaining more to conflict situations and how students are thinking about them and relating them to other things that are happening in their lives. And so this one, the one here, looks towards how is armed conflict and COVID, how in their minds those situations were conflated, and the feelings that they had, where they were able to read into both of them. And really sort of an interesting perspective there. And then our friend here, Maya, looking at the climate fires in Australia, she was basing this off of, and thinking to how that impacts sort of the relationship between people and nature. And then we have our friend here from Edmonton Catholic who did this brilliant piece of art, just looking at how does the difference between the global north and the global south and our experiences with climate change impact sort of our outlook on our futures. Such an impactful sort of way of thinking about these ideas without, sometimes we can't find the words, but we want to speak to them. And then our friend here, Mark, who created this poster around the war in Somalia and his own family's relationship to that journey and the impact that had on his family. And then we have here some global art that was submitted, as you were saying, for that larger Art for Climate campaign, and looking at how does climate impact our communities and the way that we see the people living in our communities, the way that we see our community and the relationship to land and nature and the futures that we have. And so we have some brilliant art here submitted from friends around the world, Nigeria, India, the Philippines, as they really sort of think to what the fears and the obstacles that they face, and how they can express that and work through that in a way that that's not dependent on language or words or other sorts of knowledge sharing, but is really impactful in those themes that are drawn out from us in impactful art. I'm going to stop sharing there and hand back over to Yasmin.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sarah. So we actually just have a few other posters that were sent in. So I'm just going to give me a moment so that I can share these lovely posters. But these were really great examples. These art pieces were wonderful too. I'm not sure if our panelists also would like to weigh in as I pull up the slides on any thoughts on these artwork as well for campaign. But I'll give you a moment if anyone would like to comment on the pieces of artwork. These really, to me, they told a lot of emotion and story as well. So they were truly just wonderful to see as youth action and that call to action that youth were participating in as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and share. Just give me a moment. Okay.
And as Yasmin's pulling up the posters, I just wanted to comment on how clear the story was through each of the pieces of artwork that the students shared with the Center for Global Education. So the posters that we're about to see have some incredible information in them that the students have reflected on. If, as you're still considering creating a poster for this campaign, if you're leaning more towards telling story through images, again, go back to some of that wonderful artwork that Sarah just shared with us from the Center for Global Education. And there's some great examples of how to use images to tell story too.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrea. So this is a Fourth Step Fight magazine from Anthony and from Mr. Betty's class at York Girls Collegiate Institute in Toronto. So Anthony here does a really great job of summarizing Gail's story and reflecting on the fact that armed groups named in his story were careless about the environmental damage caused by the means and methods they used to engage in hostilities. He reflects very well on the interrelationship between the actions of the armed groups and the long-term impact of environmental damage on his community. Anthony here also proposes some very clear actions for local government, including proactive steps to keep Miguel's community safe and ensuring access to a temporary camp in a safe zone. He also proposes that armed groups take more mindful approaches to carrying out their actions. Military objectives should not include long-term harms to the environment. Like in Miguel's story, water sources should not be targeted. Anthony also proposes here further action for NGOs, such as planting trees and ensuring safe access to water, and Canadian citizens like supporting NGOs operating in conflict zones and holding governments to account for their international obligations. He also promises another issue of his magazine, which we can't wait to read. So this was a really great example. I know that I was really inspired and excited to see this poster come in, and looking at it now, I think it's very mindful. It has a lot of fantastic thought and critical thinking in this poster. I'm opening the floor to our panelists. If you would like to speak on this poster or your thoughts as well, the floor is yours.
Oh, so I think, yeah, we've got another example that's come in. I'll hand it over to you, Yasmin.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, so this is a poster from Shaylin from Miss Critch's class in Sir Wilfrid Laurier SS in Ottawa. Shaylin did a really great job summarizing the links between conflict, climate, and migration in the global context that Angela discussed at our humanitarian exchange. Shaylin's poster also captures how international humanitarian law works to protect the natural environment in 3 points. So proposes action to support the work of Save the Children in conflict zones and encourages students, communities, and governments to work together on information sharing, education, and action. So Shaylin captured this very, very well. Again, another key and great example of a poster campaign here. So again, thank you so much for sharing this with us and for sharing this with everyone here today. Again, I'll give a few seconds to open the floor in case any of our panelists would like to weigh in or comment on any of the posters, any of the artwork that were shared today. Okay, fantastic. So I'll go ahead and open the floor to our communications delegate, Angela Hill, who will be speaking about ethical communications and working in the field. She will be speaking towards experiences that she has had in the field as well. So very exciting stuff to hear today. So Angela, the floor is yours.
Hi, please let me know if you can hear me. I know I've been having some trouble hearing, so I'm not sure if it's my connection. Oh, it's very
You're
quiet.
sounding great.
Okay, great, thank you. So if you go to the next slide, so I've got what I like to call 2 boring text slides and then lots of interesting other slides. So just really quickly, when we talk about communicating big ideas, humanitarian issues, conflict issues, climate change issues, why do we do it? So we can inform people about our work as the Red Cross or the work that's being done. We can raise awareness of humanitarian crises and emergencies. You saw that with some of the artwork that was shown, some of these posters exactly touch on this. It could be about fundraising, bringing in more funds to support this work, to support new initiatives that will lead to better outcomes. It's about transparency. If you have donors that are supporting your cause, when we communicate, we help them understand the work that we're doing. They understand the changes that are being made. When the Red Cross communicates, one of the things we do is to communicate our 7 fundamental principles. We want to advocate on behalf of the people we work with and address misconceptions. Again, I think you see this with the posters campaign, and some of that art is about, perhaps challenging people's ideas of how things are or how they are, and challenge them to think in a new way. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about how we can communicate ethically. So now we know why we need to communicate, but how do we do it ethically, especially when we're talking about disaster or crisis communications? So there's sort of 3 really important pieces that we talk about, one of which is around portraying people with dignity. How are we thinking about people who have been impacted by war or conflict or natural disasters due to climate change? How are we talking about them? And how do we want that conversation to go? For many people, these are some of their worst moments. If there's been flooding and they've lost everything, or we're even seeing now already whole communities are being evacuated because of wildfires across Canada. You've had to leave everything behind. You haven't had much time to leave your house. How are people feeling, and how can we talk about the disaster without causing greater issues for them? How can we give them dignity in what they're doing? And one of the ways we can really do that is talking about resilience and showing resilience. How is the community coming together? How are people helping each other? It's not just about the disaster itself, but also how people are starting to recover from the moment they're impacted. And then one of the really big things we talk about when we do communicating and communications from a humanitarian standpoint is consent. People have the right to say no. They don't want their story used. They don't want their picture used. People have the right to understand how their story will be used. So I can come up and say, hey, can I take your picture? And someone will say yes. But if they don't understand that we're going to then make a giant poster that's going to go across the country, what they've said yes to is simply you taking their picture, not how it will be used. So when we talk about communicating ethically, if we're going to share individual stories, we really want to figure out or ensure that they fully understand and that they have the right to say no. We also have to think about power imbalances. A lot of times when we are in a position to help tell someone's story, we are also with an organization that's bringing aid. We are coming from a place that is safe, where people are healthy. Perhaps that's not the situation where they are, and there might be an obligation to say yes, but they feel an obligation to say yes, and that is not there. So all of these things have to be taken into consideration. And I want to be honest, I do this work, I don't have all the answers. There's this balance, and I'm sure as you're doing your art and your posters, you see this. How do you tell an interesting story? How do you get the attention of people who have basketball practice after school, homework that's due, exams coming up, summer holidays coming up, plans for a camping trip. How do you balance all of these things that happen in everyday life with the needs for interesting and engaging content? And that is something we struggle with when we do our work every time we do it. How do we balance how to tell the story, how to capture attention, but ensuring the dignity and it is led by the people who are impacted? This continues to be part of the conversation. And I hope when you think about how to present posters and how to present information, this is part of your conversation also. So now to the more fun slides. So when we talk about communicating from disaster zones or communicating from conflict, this is what it can look like. You might be doing interviews in a tent or using generator power to try and upload photos using all sorts of bandwidth. Perhaps you have a whole community coming out to help you take video of a water gathering station, or you meet with a team of people between them running out to a different area just to ask some questions before they go. So this is what it can look like to do communications work in a humanitarian context. So now we'll go to the next slide. And I want to talk about some stories from the field and how can we try and capture stories of resilience even in difficult times. So as it was mentioned, I'm currently in Ukraine. I've been supporting the operation here remotely and in person in country for about, well, since last year, since late November. And I think when we talk about, how we can share our stories is both of these people have suffered significant losses. So we could focus on that. We could tell that story, or we could focus on the fact that they found each other and they have found comfort in each other. They've both evacuated from areas of Ukraine that are where there is heavy conflict. They did not know each other before, but in where they're staying now, the older woman has become part of the home care program that the Red Cross offers. And the younger woman decided that she wanted to be part of a volunteering thing, something to do while she couldn't be at home. And together they have been a huge comfort to each other. So I went and sat with them one day while they shared stories and told stories. And then we had this moment where she was like, oh, take a picture of her with me for me. And I was like, well, could I use this picture to share some of the stories and some of the work that's happening also? And they said, please, yes, of course. So even when there's moments of stress and even when the information is really sad, you can try and find nuggets or moments of joy or hope that help people remember without feeling overwhelmed. And I think Sarah mentioned that earlier is, how can we translate it to action? And sometimes when we hear a lot of really sad information, it can feel overwhelming. And so if we can find joy, if we can find that kernel of hope, then that can help us build a story that will hold people's attention and let them feel inspired. So go to the next slide. It's sort of another take on this. So there's 3 stories with this. We'll talk about each picture as we go. So it was a field hospital in Mozambique after a cyclone destroyed the hospital. One of the things that the hospital did the most often in this community was perform emergency C-sections for mothers to be able to give safe births. In the middle of this operation, the power went out. So the only lights, the main generator was being used to help run the equipment needed to help the mom go through the operation, which means when the baby needed some support, the nurses and doctors worked as a team with headlamps to use that to light the situation. So this is a very stressful situation, but it shows how the Canadian Red Cross works. If you go to the next slide, this is the same baby with her mom. So because of the work that was happening, the baby was able to be saved, the mom was able to be saved, and they could be reunited and recover at the hospital. If you go to the next slide. This was the dad holding his newborn baby while he was waiting for his wife to get out of surgery. And it just shows how, there's these moments of joy, these moments of hope within very difficult situations. And then with this, I always look for a way to try and give back. If someone is telling their story, if someone's trusting you with the story or their photos, how can we give back? So with this family, we were able to print and give them the photos. So in an area of Mozambique where people often don't get to have baby photos, they don't often get to have family photos. We were able to use their story to help us talk about work, but also give back to them. They were able to have family photos that they could then keep for the rest of their lives. And I've got one more slide, I think. Again, talking about finding people are naturally drawn to tragedy, but I think it's really important the more we communicate, the more we don't focus on that tragedy. So this is two different situations of malnutrition within children. So on the left is in Somaliland, when a severe drought has been ongoing. Children are not getting enough to eat. And on the right is in refugee camps in Bangladesh from people who are fleeing violence in Myanmar. And in both cases, because of the situations, because of the uncertainty of where people could live, because of a lack of access to food and clean water, children were really suffering. Malnutrition rates were really high. In some areas, there was concern about famine. And so historically, there would be this urge to show pictures of children lying just on the ground, not moving. What we really try and do is capture these same children, but getting help. So in both of these cases, children have been given access to, it's called Plumpy Nut. It's a high calorie, very nutritious, almost like a peanut butter substance that are given to kids who don't have a lot of other nutritional options. They love it. It's sweet and it's healthy. And so it's not about, I mean, these are kids who need help. These are kids who aren't doing great, but they're getting help. There is something positive in it. So I think when you try and communicate, these are the things that I think about. These are the things that we look for and to help people resonate with your message, to help catch their attention, and to leave them feeling empowered and wanting to make a difference, wanting to support and make change. My next slide, I think, says questions. So if you have any, I'm happy to answer them. And as others mentioned, if you do have questions later on that you want to submit, they'll drop that email into the chat box for you, and they can get them to me and I can help fill in if you're not feeling comfortable asking now.
Angela, I know that there must be questions coming in on the chat. So as students sort of think of a question they want to ask, I know we have some students here from Ontario and Trinidad, and if they'd like to add anything, or maybe even I know we have a school or two on YouTube. But from as I start you off, how do you? I mean, these experiences are very impactful. And I'm sure like that you are in the midst of other people's trauma and your own trauma in a way. Like, how do you engage in self-care in your work? Because I think that's probably a really important part of your job.
Yeah, that's another one of those ones that I think is a constant growing process for all of us who do this work, and something we're constantly learning and refining. A tiny piece of you, a tiny part of your heart breaks. It's not possible to have conversations with moms who are desperate to help their children and would, like, this is where we talk about resiliency. These are moms who would do everything to help their children. They just don't have the support needed to do it. They know the steps, and your heart breaks a little bit, but you are also so inspired by the strength. And so, you know, going away from that, that's what I really try to remember. And then as far as like things I do to take care of myself is being able to talk about it. Events like this really help me. I think that if I can channel some of the hurt or some of the pain I feel into sharing information with others, encouraging others to take steps and make differences in their own lives, to learn and educate those around them, it is sort of part of my catharsis or part of my yeah, my care. My family, my friends hear a lot about these things also.
Yeah. Now, this session, again, if anyone has a question, please, you can use the raise your hand function. You can use the chat. We would love to have you participate and ask your questions to our speaker, just with her wealth of experience. But this summit was focused on climate and how climate can compound, or the future of climate is going to cause even greater crisis. You've seen some of I mean, you're in the Ukraine now. How does, maybe that as a specific lens, how does climate change sort of amplify crises that are already ongoing? Like, what do you see as the future for that? Does the question make sense? I'm trying to tie climate on
It
top of the work that
it
you're already doing and
totally
seeing.
does. You know, I can give a couple of different examples. I mean, from what I've seen and the experiences I've had, especially over the last 5 years, I would say that if governments, if individuals are not thinking about the plans in the future through a climate and migration lens, we're woefully unprepared for what the future looks like. Here in Ukraine, I mean, it's little things. I can't say if it's directly related to climate change here in Ukraine, but it's still cold. Everyone keeps telling me when I've been here that it's usually so warm after Easter. It should be warm now. Why? It's not warm. And when you think, okay, well, it's cold for a bit longer, who cares? But when your infrastructure has been affected because of explosions, because of violence, then cold is a bigger problem because now you don't have power and your heating is electric, right? So it's not as simple as like, oh, well, it's a little bit colder for longer. Fine. It's a bigger deal than that. Another really clear example for me is when we talk about Somaliland. This is a drought. Like there's within the nomadic people there, the ones who herd goats or sheep as they're living. It is a really great way to make a living in rural Somalia. There are historical cycles within the year of wet periods and dry periods, and migration of these families happens around those periods. When I was there in early 2023, it was a 2-year drought. So it was no longer a cycle. So, you know, they had the wet period and that was great. And then they moved to the area where they usually get water and there was no water. And then they moved to a new area and there was no water. And they moved to a different area and there was no water. And all of the people were then trying to converge on the places where there was still some water, but you know, very few and far between. So people who used to might have hundreds of heads of animals in their herds had 7 goats left, right? And trying to keep those alive. So when it rains again, they can breed their animals and restart their flocks, but also realizing that perhaps if they could sell that next goat, they can buy enough rice to feed their children for the next few weeks. And how do you balance that decision with planning for the future and those immediate needs and emergency needs right now? Because you could sell your rest of your goat and protect your children now, but then what do you do in a month? It doesn't matter if it rains, you don't have the stock to start again. And so then you move to a city, right? And there's already, you know, difficult situations happening within those cities and people are being moved and they're moving again, and then a conflict breaks out. So you moved because you didn't have access to water, so you moved to the city. And then a conflict breaks out near that city, and now you're moving again. And so it's this displacement after displacement after displacement.
Well, and moving to the city doesn't just brings new problems that you might not have the skills to adapt to, right? And just having those mechanisms to access housing and employment and all of the things that weren't challenges before become new challenges, and it just shifts your challenges. Thanks so much for that firsthand sort of account of where you see it happening. Now I see we have a question in the chat from you. What do you think was your most impactful image to date and why?
It's
yeah.
hard. Sorry, go ahead.
Then there was like a secondary, how might that apply to making of posters for students?
I don't know if I can sort of say one in particular is a huge impact. I think some of the most significant to me came from the population movement operation in Bangladesh in 2017. And it was a situation where so many people wanted to have their story heard. So they were very eager to speak, very eager to be photographed. And so it was a lot of faces. And when we can see someone's eyes, when we can really see their situation, their emotion, what they're living in their faces and their eyes and how they interact with the people around them in those pictures. I think without even being able to write a lot, it tells the story. Maybe there is an example from Ukraine. When I was in Romania at the start of the conflict in Ukraine, where people were becoming refugees. We were just talking about this. So they were leaving Ukraine and arriving in Romania as refugees. And this one woman got off the train and she came into this space being run by the Romanian Red Cross for women and children. And I sort of spoke with her for a bit and asked if I could take a picture, and she said yes. And then so some other volunteers came over to check in and see how she's doing, and she couldn't speak Romanian, and we didn't have any Ukrainian speakers there, but she just kept saying over and over again, Mariupol, Mariupol. And at that time, we all knew what that meant. So if she'd come from that city, we could imagine in that moment what significant trauma she had seen. And so everyone was tearing up, and, you capture that moment, and you just, all you need to write is, this woman found safety with Red Cross volunteers after leaving Mariupol.
Yeah.
So I think it doesn't need to be tons of information. It can just be a moment of emotion, a moment of caring, a moment of like sharedness, if that's a word, with a little bit of information. And I think when we make posters, this can be another way of doing it. I just thinking about the posters we saw, the kids, there was a kid's face and it was forced to fight. That says so much. And then people, you put on a QR code, right? And you have a website or, just a place with all the rest of the information. So you've caught their attention. They want to know more, and then you can provide it to them.
I think too, your comment earlier about shifting the framing of these images. So like instead of showing the graphic nature of suffering, showing the child receiving nourishment and thriving. And we work with another organization, and he was doing work in refugee camps with art therapy with children, and had this wonderful conversation where he was sharing all the pictures that he was sharing were hopeful pictures with the children smiling and dancing and laughing and painted hands and playing in water. And because there's that need too to not just not profit, but of source thrive off of these negative images, but that we can use powerful, hopeful images. And I really loved how you were saying that the Red Cross was shifting to that it's not just about, showing people in despair. It's that we need to also showcase that there's still hope and there's still healing. And then there's all these wonderful things that come together. And how does that play into, our messaging around this? So I
think it's what helps make it relatable. So this is really the movement across the humanitarian sector, not just Red Cross. We're really moving away from these super stark, drastic pictures, because it's what makes it relatable. I think one of the most incredible photos, I work with a colleague from the Palestine Red Crescent Society who lives in Gaza, and we message back and forth all the time and share some of his messages through the Red Cross Network. And he sent me a picture of him playing with his daughter. And in the background is the sea of tents, which is where they're now living. But it's that simple act of playing with one's daughter. And I think that can resonate with people here, where it's like, when you go to play with your kid, can you imagine if this was the situation you did that in? And I think that people can sit and be like, wait, I play with my daughter. Yeah. I know what that's like. I know what she likes to be amused. I know what makes her laugh. Oh my God, to do that in such difficult circumstances really helps people connect, and really breaks through that everyday sort of baseline noise.
Just that being able to really resonate and see yourself in those shoes. I mean, because so many of us can't imagine what it's like to be there, and the drastic image doesn't allow that sort of connection. But you're right, like I'm a parent, seeing a parent play with their child is just reading myself into a situation which I already don't want to read myself into, but allows that access, right? And that point of view that is, and even for children to see that message and be like, yeah, I'd still be playing with my dad. It's relatable for them as well. Angela, thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge and your real, like, on the ground experiences and how this has impacted you and how you've formed sort of and informed your own sort of thoughts on this issue. And it's been so impactful having you to start our conversation in April and then bring it together here in May, and, show that transition to students around that. Even in no matter where they are in Canada or around the world, they can make impact by sharing and by learning and by engaging in this, and not just, it's so easy to flip the channel these days where there's so much going on in the world and so much that needs our attention, but to really think deeply and think, how does this impact me, and what change, however small, can I make to sort of improve the world, to make the world better. And I think that's an amazing message that we all need to think about. I'm going to pass now over to our friends at the Red Cross, Andrea, to go on to the next stage. I think I took up too much time with questions, but Angela, you're just so amazing. So thanks. Andrea, over to you.
No, thank you so much, Angela, in particular for talking about ethical information sharing through use of story and photos in communications. That's what this summit's all about. But again, I'll echo what Sarah said. Thank you so much for also highlighting the importance of messages of hope and highlighting positive stories. We did see that in some of the student poster examples that were submitted as well. So we really love to see that the students who have participated in the poster campaign so far have also highlighted steps for action for students. They've talked about areas of help that communities can engage in, both with their local governments as well as with other charities and NGOs. So as we're wrapping up our summit showcase today, we would of course like to encourage continued engagement. So we are sharing the message that there is still time to submit a poster. What we would like to do is just spend these next few minutes with a bit of a refresher on what you can do if you would like to submit a poster for the campaign. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Yasmin. So I'll quickly walk you through some of the pieces of information that you can include in your poster. Remember to communicate key facts, and we saw that in the examples earlier. So share 3 factoids, in particular showing the interrelationships between conflict, climate, and migration. And if you can, also highlight some rules of international humanitarian law. So tell us what you've learned about how international humanitarian law should protect the environment during an armed conflict and how it aims to protect the environment. And then communicate 3 things that can be done about the issue. So focus on actions for local government, focus on actions for the government in your country, focus on concrete actions that communities can take. What's really helpful, since you're also sharing these in your schools, tell students what they can do about the issue. And again, of course, make it visually engaging, use lots of facts and figures, choose safe images. You can use your own images and use lots of borders and backgrounds as well. And on the next slide here, some of you might be familiar with this poster. This is a really helpful example that our stellar MC of events, Yasmin, has created for us. So we have some examples here that show how easy it is to summarize some key information about how armed conflict impacts the environment. Yasmin has chosen to talk about deforestation and oil spills. This poster also highlights how community education and youth-led action and policy support can help limit the impact of armed conflict on the environment and migration. And there's also some information on how international humanitarian law can limit the damages that parties to an armed conflict can cause to the environment. And there's also a call to action to learn more on the ICRC's website. So that's the International Committee of the Red Cross. If you go to the next slide, please, Yasmin. You can also choose to highlight other topics related to armed conflict and international humanitarian law in your poster campaign. So again, we have an example here from last year's summit showing how children are impacted by armed conflict. And then we'll quickly go to the next slide. As we also saw with the student artwork examples, we are encouraging, if you don't wish to submit a poster, you can also submit your own activity. So it can be a short video, you can write a short essay or blog, you can host a fundraiser and tell us about it, you can create a Kahoot quiz and share it with us. And you can also do a creative writing activity. And last year we had a story walk campaign from one of the schools where students wrote poems from the perspective of children affected by armed conflict. Next slide, please, Yasmin. And again, this is the exciting part. We're holding our draw next Friday, the 24th. So we'll share the results of that draw with you in a quick video in the communique that we're sending to all of the schools on a weekly basis who are participating in the summit. And we have 5 books to win from students who submit a poster to the campaign. So the books are related to at least one of the three themes of the Youth Action Summit. So they're either related to one or more of our themes on conflict, climate, and migration. And the books are My Long List of Impossible Things, A Long Walk to Water, The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, The Kite Runner, and Turtle Island. And we'll just go to our last slide here. We'd love to hear what you thought of today's event. So we have a really quick evaluation. If you're following the recording after, you can also access it. But if you do have a couple of quick minutes, you can just scan that QR code or go to slido.com. And once you're on the site, you enter the event code YAS for Youth Action Summit. I'm also posting the details and the direct link in the chat for those of you who are joining us over Zoom. And with that, while we still have the evaluation up, I would just once again like to thank all of our expert speakers today. Thank you so much, Fanny, for helping us think about how international humanitarian law aims to protect the natural environment. Thank you also for having us reflect on the interrelationships between conflict, climate, and migration with that very helpful Slido quiz that we did together earlier. Thanks again to Angela for your professional expertise on developing impactful and ethical communications, very helpful knowledge to use for the poster campaigns. Thank you so much to our wonderful and energetic MC, Yasmin Ahanin. Yasmin, it's been wonderful to have you at the helm of the showcase, and our schools are very much engaged under your leadership. And of course, thank you so much to our event hosts and partners from the Center for Global Education. So thank you so much to Sarah Flynn and Rebecca Moon for your support today. Thank you to Anthony and Shaylin for your very informative posters. And finally, thank you so much to all of our participating schools. There were many avenues to engagement with this year's summit, and it was so wonderful to see all of you engaged in at least one of the entry points that we had for you between our classroom activities and the campaign, and of course, our engaging events with our hosts and our speakers. So that concludes today's Summit Showcase. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to seeing more posters as they come in.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Good to see you, Wendy.
Goodbye.
Thanks for joining.